Oliver never knew what it was like to have a home. For as long as he could remember, he had been just a number in a system that moved him from place to place, without anyone truly caring about who he was or what he felt. He grew up hearing empty promises from temporary foster families that always ended up giving up on him when things got difficult. Over time, he learned not to form attachments, not to expect kindness or affection, and, above all, not to trust anyone. That cold afternoon, he sat in a corner of the square, near a fountain, watching the people in the park. Families strolled, children ran around laughing, and couples sat on benches, sharing moments that, to him, were just scenes from a world he had never belonged to. The sweet smell of popcorn mixed with the chilly air, triggering an uncomfortable hunger. He glanced at the food stands but knew begging wouldn't help. Adults averted their eyes, pretending he wasn't there. He was invisible. The shelter he was currently staying in was just another among so many. Always crowded, noisy, and cold. The rules were strict, and the other children weren't exactly friendly. The caregivers did their best, but they were always too busy to truly pay attention to someone like him. The thought of spending the rest of his childhood being pushed from one place to another made something inside him break. He decided he wouldn't stay there anymore. He wouldn't be just another name lost in the system. If no one wanted to give him a family, he would find a way to survive on his own. He waited until the sun started to set, the perfect moment to leave unnoticed. The shelter was big, and the staff had more children to care for than they could handle. As shadows began to take over the city, he moved away from the park and walked along the sidewalk without looking back. His heart pounded, but he kept his face steady. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but anywhere was better than returning to that shelter. As he walked, he passed by brightly lit store windows displaying toys and clothes. Inside, children pointed at things they wanted while parents smiled, some carrying bags full of purchases. Oliver looked away, trying not to think about the fact that no one had ever bought him a present, a new pair of shoes, or even a birthday cake. Night had completely fallen, and the cold intensified. The wind cut through his thin clothes, making him shiver. He crossed an alley, looking around to make sure no one was following him. Then, he found a spot between two large dumpsters and decided to sit. The ground was freezing, but he was too tired to keep walking. He leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes. This would be his first night alone in the world. The night was colder than Oliver had imagined. He hugged his knees, trying to stop shivering. The wind blew through the alley, carrying the smell of garbage and dampness. The wall he leaned against was rough and icy, but it was the only somewhat sheltered place he had found. He tried to sleep, but the city's noise and his fear kept him alert. Footsteps echoed in the distance, and rough voices broke the silence of the night. Oliver didn't want to draw attention, so he remained motionless, breathing as quietly as possible. Time dragged on. The cold was unbearable, and his stomach growled with hunger. During the day, he had seen people throwing leftover food into the trash. Now, he considered the possibility of searching through garbage bags for something to eat, but the thought disgusted him. He had never been this hungry before. He closed his eyes and tried to distract himself. He imagined what it would be like to have a real home, his own room, a warm bed. He thought about school, about other children playing during recess, something he had only seen from afar but never experienced. He even thought about how nice it would be if someone actually missed him. The sound of breaking bottles made him shrink even more. A group of homeless men argued nearby. One of them looked in his direction, and Oliver held his breath. The man said nothing, just shook his head and kept walking. Even so, Oliver decided to leave. The last thing he wanted was to get caught up in trouble. He wandered the empty streets aimlessly. Some stores still had flashing signs, and occasional cars passed by, but the city was much quieter than during the day. After a while, he arrived at a public park. It was a large place with benches and scattered trees. Oliver chose a wooden bench under a big tree and sat down. He was exhausted, but the cold and uncertainty made it impossible to rest. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to convince himself that everything would be fine. Maybe by morning, things would seem less scary. Maybe he'd find a way to get food. Maybe all of this was just a nightmare he would wake up from. He finally drifted off to sleep, only to be startled awake by a tap on his shoulder. His eyes flew open, and he saw a security guard standing in front of him. "This isn't a place to sleep, kid. Move along." Oliver's eyes widened, still groggy. Without arguing, he got up and walked away. His legs felt heavy, and his stomach ached with hunger. He looked around, searching for another place to rest, but nothing seemed safe enough. The city, so full of people, felt like a desert to him. Reality hit him hard. Surviving on the streets would be much harder than he had imagined. The day dawned cold and cloudy. Oliver's entire body ached from sleeping on the hard, freezing bench. He rubbed his eyes, trying to orient himself. His stomach was painfully empty, and his head felt heavy. The city was already in motion. People walked briskly, cars honked, and workers filled the sidewalks. Oliver felt small among so many people. He needed to eat. He walked to a square where food stalls were being set up. The smell of fresh bread and fruit was intoxicating, but he had no money. He thought about asking for something, but people seemed too busy to notice him. His hunger grew stronger. He saw an old man arranging apples at a fruit stall. Without thinking too much, Oliver crept closer. He waited until the man turned away to grab something, and in one quick motion, he snatched an apple and ran. "Hey, get back here, kid," the vendor shouted. Oliver ran as fast as he could, dodging pedestrians. The sound of hurried footsteps behind him made his heart race. He turned a corner and darted into an alley, jumping over a few cardboard boxes and hiding behind a dumpster. His chest heaved, his heart pounded. He stayed completely still until he was sure no one was following him. When silence finally returned, he took a deep breath and looked at the apple in his hands. It was dirty and slightly bruised, but it was food. He took a big bite, feeling the sweet juice fill his mouth. It was the best thing he had eaten in days. But as he chewed, a knot formed in his throat. He had never stolen before. In the foster homes, they always said stealing was for people with no character. But he had no choice. If he didn't eat, he would die. He finished the apple and sat there, trying to ignore the emptiness inside him. Surviving on the streets was nothing like he had imagined. It wasn't just freedom. It was fear, hunger, cold, and loneliness. He stood up and started walking with no destination in mind. But he didn't get far. His body was weak and his head spun. The cold, hunger, and exhaustion had taken their toll. His eyes grew heavy, and before he could react, everything went black. Oliver woke up to the sensation of something warm on his forehead. He blinked a few times, disoriented, and realized he was lying on an old couch, covered with a thin blanket. The room he was in was small and simple, with worn-out furniture but a cozy atmosphere. The smell of food drifted from the kitchen, making his stomach growl. That's when he noticed someone sitting beside him. A woman with dark hair and kind eyes was watching him. "You're awake," she said with a gentle smile. "How are you feeling?" Oliver instinctively pulled away, sitting up on the couch. His eyes darted around the room. How had he gotten here? Who was this woman? "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "My name is Helena," she replied calmly. "My husband and I found you collapsed on the sidewalk yesterday afternoon. You were freezing and had a fever, so we brought you home." Oliver looked around, his chest tightening. Was this good or bad? They seemed kind, but he had met many people who seemed nice at first, only to leave him later. "I didn't ask for help," he murmured. "I know," Helena said softly. "But you needed it." Before he could respond, hurried footsteps echoed in the room, and two children ran in. A boy about 7 years old, and a little girl no older than 5, both still in pajamas. "He's awake," the boy shouted. "What's your name?" the little girl asked, climbing onto the couch without hesitation. Oliver didn't know what to say. "Kids, give him some space," a man's voice called out. A tall man entered the room, drying his hands on a dish towel. His eyes were tired but kind. "I'm Ricardo, Helena's husband," he said. "And these are our kids, Lucas and Sophia." Oliver looked at them all, feeling overwhelmed. They were being too nice. He needed to get out before he started liking this attention. Helena noticed his discomfort. "You must be starving," she said. "I'll get you something to eat." The smell of fresh bread filled the air, and Oliver's mouth watered. But he didn't want to stay. He didn't want to get attached. "I'm fine," he said, standing up. "I'm leaving." But his legs buckled, and he almost fell. Ricardo caught him just in time. "Not so fast," the man said. "You're still weak." Oliver pulled away, frustrated at his own weakness. "I'm not used to anyone helping me," Helena sighed. "I know. But for now, just rest." Oliver wanted to resist, but his body betrayed him. He sat back down, and Sophia smiled at him. "Can you be our new brother?" His heart pounded. He shook his head. "I'm not part of your family." "Family doesn't have to be blood," Lucas said. Oliver looked away. He didn't want to believe that. He didn't want to like this house, because if he did, it meant he could lose it. And he didn't want to lose anything anymore. Oliver spent the rest of the day in silence, observing everything around him. He felt out of place, like he had invaded a space that wasn't his. Helena and Ricardo were too kind, and it unsettled him. He was used to distrust and indifference, not free kindness. That afternoon, Helena insisted he eat something. At first, he hesitated. Accepting food meant accepting their kindness, and he didn't want to depend on anyone. But hunger won. She served him a plate of hot soup with pieces of bread. The smell made his stomach twist, and he started eating slowly, testing each bite as if expecting some kind of trick. But there was none. "Eat slowly," Helena said, smiling. "If you want more, just ask." That "if you want more" caught Oliver by surprise. In shelters, food was rationed, and he rarely ate enough. The idea that he could have more seemed surreal. "Thank you," he murmured, not meeting her gaze. As night fell, Helena and Ricardo prepared dinner. The table was set with simple but neatly arranged plates and silverware. Lucas and Sophia were excited, chatting about their day. "Come sit, Oliver," Ricardo called. Oliver hesitated. He couldn't remember the last time he had dinner at a table with a family. He usually ate alone or in crowded shelters where no one spoke to him. But hunger won again. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Tonight, we have rice, beans, and roasted chicken," Helena announced. Lucas grabbed a drumstick and handed it to Oliver. "Do you like chicken?" Oliver took the piece and nodded. Dinner continued with cheerful conversations. Helena asked Lucas about school, and Sophia excitedly talked about losing a tooth. Ricardo laughed and joked with the kids. Oliver just listened. He wasn't used to this, to the idea that he could be included in the conversation, that his opinion might matter. For a moment, he felt a strange sensation he couldn't quite define, a feeling of belonging, but he forced himself to ignore it. Oliver woke up on the couch the next morning, feeling the warmth of the blanket Helena had left for him. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air, and the sound of footsteps and voices in the kitchen told him that the family was already awake. He stretched, but then stopped as reality hit him. He was still here. That couldn't be good. He got up and walked to the kitchen. Helena was smiling as she spread butter on a slice of bread, while Ricardo read the newspaper. Lucas and Sophia were eating, giggling about some silly joke. "Did you sleep well?" Helena asked. Oliver only nodded. He didn't know what to say. "Come sit down, there's coffee for you too." He hesitated, then sat at the table and took a piece of bread. Ricardo looked at him seriously. "What do you plan to do now, Oliver?" The question made him freeze. He didn't know. He couldn't stay here. He wasn't part of this family. I'm leaving," he answered quietly. Silence fell over the table. "Are you sure?" Helena asked, not looking surprised. He nodded. "I don't belong here. You've already done a lot for me. But I can take care of myself." Lucas and Sophia looked disappointed. "But where will you go?" Sophia asked. He didn't have an answer, but he couldn't admit that. "I'll figure something out," he said. Ricardo crossed his arms. "If that's your choice, we won't stop you. But I want you to know that you can stay." Oliver, his chest tightened. Did they really want him to stay? He lowered his head. "Thank you, but I can't." He didn't want to get attached. He didn't want to start liking this house, because he knew that, in the end, like always, he'd be alone. It was better to leave before it hurt too much. Helena sighed but didn't argue. All right, Oliver, but at least have breakfast before you go. He looked at the bread in his hand and nodded. But deep down he wondered, was he making the right choice? The cold wind stung Oliver's face as he walked through the city, trying to ignore the tight feeling in his chest. He had made his decision. Leaving was the right thing to do. It was better this way. But why did each step feel so heavy? He wandered aimlessly all morning, searching for a place to stay. He returned to the park where he had slept before, but the bench was now occupied by a grumpy-looking man who stared at him in a way that made Oliver back away. He walked to a square where street vendors were serving hurried customers. He smelled food and realized he hadn't thought about the most obvious problem. How would he eat? No money, no place to sleep, no plan. He sat in a corner of the square watching people pass by. Some walked quickly, others stopped to buy coffee or a snack. Then his eyes locked onto something. A woman dropped a bill while grabbing her change. She didn't notice. The money lay on the ground for a few seconds before someone else picked it up. Oliver's breath quickened. He could have taken it first. He could have grabbed it and kept it. But even though his stomach ached with hunger, something inside him told him it wasn't right. The problem was that the streets didn't follow rules of right and wrong. The streets were cruel. A shadow blocked the light beside him. A man in dirty clothes was watching him with a calculating look. You alone, kid? Oliver tensed. None of your business. The man chuckled, revealing yellowed teeth. Street kids always think they can handle everything. Until they learn what real suffering is. Oliver swallowed hard. I don't want trouble. Then you should get out of this life before it eats you alive. The man walked away, but the tension lingered. A chill ran down Oliver's spine. He knew he wouldn't survive much longer like this. Deep down, a voice whispered in his mind, you should have stayed. He ignored it, but not for long, because as soon as he started thinking about his next meal, a heavy hand grabbed his arm. His heart pounded. Oliver! He turned, startled, and saw Ricardo standing in front of him. What are you doing here? The man asked. Oliver pulled his arm free. It's none of your business. Ricardo sighed, crossing his arms. Have you eaten anything today? Oliver pressed his lips together but didn't answer. That's what I thought, Ricardo said. Come on. You're coming with me. I don't need help. If you didn't, you wouldn't be alone in a place like this. Oliver hesitated. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew Ricardo was right. So when the man turned to leave, Oliver followed him, without saying a word. When they arrived at the house, Helena ran to the door, her face filled with relief. Thank God! She pulled Oliver into a sudden hug. He stiffened, unsure how to react. You can't just disappear without knowing where you're going, she said, pulling back to look at him. Are you okay? Are you hungry? Oliver looked away. I'm fine, but the loud growl of his stomach betrayed the lie. Helena smiled slightly and called Ricardo to help prepare some food. Meanwhile, Lucas and Sophia ran up to him. We thought you were never coming back, Sophia said. I didn't come back, Oliver murmured. I'm just here for now. Lucas crossed his arms. That means you're staying, right? Oliver didn't answer. Minutes later, Helena placed a full plate of food in front of him. He tried not to look desperate, but as soon as he started eating, he realized just how hungry he was. Ricardo sat at the table, watching him for a few seconds before speaking. Oliver, I need to be honest with you. Oliver paused mid-bite, his attention fully on the man. When Helena tried to enroll you in school yesterday, the system flagged us. Oliver's heart pounded. What does that mean? It means a social worker is looking for you. They want to know where you are. Oliver felt the blood drain from his face. Are they going to take me back? Helena bit her lip. We don't know yet. Then I have to go, Oliver said, already pushing his chair back. But Ricardo held up a hand. Not so fast. If you run now, things will get worse. Oliver shook his head. They're going to put me in another shelter. They'll send me to a family that doesn't care. And I'll be forgotten again. Silence filled the room. Then Helena took a deep breath. Oliver, we don't want you to leave. His eyes widened. What? We want to try to get custody of you, Ricardo said. Oliver blinked, his mind spinning. They wanted him to stay? But why? But, I'm not part of your family, he said. Family doesn't have to be blood, Helena said. Oliver had no words. It was everything he had ever wanted to hear. But, what if it went wrong? What if, in the end, they changed their minds like everyone else? His eyes flickered to Lucas and Sophia, who were smiling hopefully. He wanted to believe, but for the first time he didn't know what to do. Should he run? Or should he stay and take a chance on finally having a home? Oliver spent the rest of the day lost in thought. He listened as Helena and Ricardo talked about lawyers, social workers, and custody processes, but none of it made sense in his mind. Why were they fighting for him? He was just a lost boy, someone the system had forgotten, someone nobody had ever truly wanted. He wasn't special. And yet, there they were, discussing how they could keep him. Helena noticed his silence and sat beside him on the couch. What are you thinking about? Oliver hesitated before answering. Why are you doing this? She gave him a soft smile. Because we want you here, Oliver. But, what if you regret it? Helena frowned. Why would we regret it? He lowered his gaze. Everyone always does. Helena gently took his hand. Not everyone. Oliver wanted to believe her, but the fear still clung to him. The next morning, a car pulled up in front of the house. A man in a neatly pressed suit stepped out, carrying a folder full of papers. He knocked on the door, and Ricardo answered. Good morning. I'm Roberto Mendonça from Child Services. We received an alert about a possible irregular situation involving a minor. Helena stepped forward. Oliver isn't in danger. We're just trying to help him. Roberto nodded, studying them carefully. I need to speak with him. Oliver, who had been listening from the hallway, felt his stomach drop. This was it. If he said the wrong thing, it would all be over. He took a deep breath and stepped into the living room. Hi, he said quietly. Roberto watched him for a moment before offering a professional smile. Hello, Oliver. May I sit with you for a bit? Oliver nodded. They both sat on the couch and Roberto opened his folder. So, tell me, how did you end up here? Oliver hesitated. He glanced at Helena and Ricardo, who gave him reassuring looks. But that didn't calm the storm inside him. If he said he wanted to stay, and they sent him away anyway, it would hurt even more. But if he said he didn't want to stay, even though he did, he would be throwing away his only chance at having a home. He closed his eyes for a second. Then, when he opened them, he finally said, I ran away from the shelter. I didn't want to be moved around anymore. I was tired of people pretending to care and then leaving. I was tired of being just another kid in the system. Roberto jotted something down. And then, they found me, he said, looking at Helena and Ricardo. And they helped me. The social worker tilted his head. Do you want to stay with them, Oliver? His breath hitched. This was the moment. If he said it out loud, there would be no turning back. Yes. The word came out louder than he expected. Helena smiled softly. Ricardo nodded, looking relieved. Roberto sighed and closed his folder. Well, the process for temporary guardianship takes time. But if approved, Oliver can stay under your legal responsibility. Oliver's heart pounded. So, does that mean I can stay? It means there's a chance, Roberto said. A chance. And that was more than he had ever had before. The following days were filled with visits and interviews. Social workers inspected the house, asked endless questions, and filled out more paperwork than Oliver had ever seen in his life. Every night, he went to sleep afraid that he'd wake up and realize it had all been a dream. But then, a month later, Helena and Ricardo received a phone call. It was Roberto. When Helena hung up, she turned to Oliver, her eyes shining. We got it. The world stopped. What? Ricardo smiled. We got temporary guardianship. Oliver felt something warm spread through his chest. It was relief. It was happiness. It was belonging. Sophia ran up and hugged him tightly. "You're our brother now." Lucas joined in, wrapping his arms around them both. Oliver stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He had never been hugged like this before. But after a moment, he closed his eyes and hugged them back. Because, for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to have a family. Months passed, and Oliver slowly adjusted to his new life. First, it was strange. He wasn't used to having people who cared about where he was or what he was doing. He wasn't used to sleeping in the same bed every night. He wasn't used to sitting at a table for dinner and being asked about his day. But little by little, he started to believe it was real. Lucas taught him how to play board games. Sophia insisted on reading stories with him every night. Helena never forgot to set an extra plate for him at the table. Ricardo took him to school, helped him with homework, and treated him like a son. And one day, Oliver realized something. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just another forgotten child in the system. He had a place, family, a home. One evening, as they all sat together watching TV, Helena suddenly turned to him. "Oliver, we have something to tell you." He looked up, feeling a strange nervousness in his stomach. Ricardo smiled. "We've started the process to make your guardianship permanent." Oliver's heart skipped a beat. "You mean?" "We're adopting you," Helena said. For a moment he couldn't breathe. This was real. This was happening. His chest tightened, and his vision blurred with unshed tears. "You really want me to stay?" he whispered. Ricardo placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are our son, Oliver. No matter what." Sophia cheered. Lucas grinned. And Oliver finally let himself believe. He wasn't just a temporary guest. He wasn't someone they would eventually get tired of. He was part of this family. Forever. For the first time in his life, he had a future. And most importantly, he had a home.